The moment a boss says, "We're family here," the job changes. The contract stays the same, the pay stays the same. What changes is the list of things you are now expected to accept without pushing back. You already know the feeling. A message lands in your inbox at 9 on a Sunday, worded kindly, and something in your chest tightens because you already know that saying no will cost you more than saying yes. You once declined a weekend request and your manager was a little colder to you for a week. Nobody ever said what happened. You understood exactly what happened. That is the sentence collecting its payment. It never needs to announce itself. It only has to be said once, in the right tone, in front of the right people, and the rules of the room change underneath everyone. The meeting continues. Nothing visible has moved. Something invisible has been set in place. The word family inside a workplace is not a description. It is a substitution. A contract defines duties, compensation, rights, and the limits of each. A family does none of those things. A family runs on loyalty, sacrifice, and emotional obligation without a clear endpoint. When a company borrows the vocabulary of family, it is asking the employee to operate under family rules while being paid under contract rules. The two frameworks are not compatible, and the incompatibility is the point. One side gains leverage over your time, your energy, your silence. The other side loses the clean boundary that a contract was designed to provide. Friendliness is fine. Teamwork is useful. Neither of those concepts requires the word family. The word is chosen specifically because it carries obligation. It implies that you would never walk away from a sibling in a hard moment. It implies that leaving in a crisis is abandonment. The sentence sounds warm. The mechanism underneath it runs on pressure. Humans need to belong. That is not weakness or sentimentality. It is a basic feature of how the nervous system evolved. Spend 40 or 50 hours a week in a single environment, and that environment starts to register as a social unit, whether it actually is one or not. So when a manager says family, the worker does not hear manipulation. The worker hears safety. The worker hears, "This place will protect me if something goes wrong." That interpretation is generous and usually wrong, but it is the natural one. And this is where the asymmetry begins. A company can invoke family language without ever accepting family responsibility, an employer to mean it. So they get the compliance that family produces while keeping the flexibility that a contract allows. That gap is where everything else grows. Once the frame is in place, ordinary workplace requests stop being ordinary. They become moral tests. Staying late is no longer a scheduling question. It becomes a question of whether you care. Flexibility is no longer about operations. It becomes a statement about your character. Refusing to discuss pay openly is no longer a professional norm. It becomes a sign that you understand what matters and what does not. None of this is said directly. It does not need to be. Once the frame is family, the frame does the speaking. A request to cover someone's role becomes an opportunity to show loyalty. A refusal becomes a data point about your commitment. Saying, "I would prefer not to work this weekend," stops being a boundary and starts being read as selfishness. Taking a sick day when you are actually sick gets read as not pulling your weight. Using your allotted vacation gets recoded as someone who is not really invested in the current project cycle. Extraction inside this arrangement begins as moral reframing. A reasonable request gets recoded as generosity. Generosity gets recoded as the minimum. The minimum keeps climbing. Strip away the vocabulary and what you see is a transaction. The company gives belonging, praise, culture, a feeling of being part of something, small gestures of warmth, birthday cakes, team lunches, thoughtful messages after personal losses. These things are real, and the emotional response to them is real. What the company asks for in return is different in kind. Time beyond the scheduled time. Boundaries, meaning the erosion of them. Silence around pay, around dissatisfaction, around the question of whether this arrangement is actually working. Compliance with decisions the worker had no role in making. The company offers symbolic intimacy. The worker returns real sacrifice. The exchange feels fair because the symbolic side arrives first, in small doses, before the real demands become visible. By the time the cost of membership shows itself, the worker has already internalized the belonging. Walking away from the demand starts to feel like walking away from the belonging. That is the hook. You can see this in the texture of ordinary weeks. A message arrives at 9 in the evening. The phrasing is warm, almost apologetic. The content requires work that night. Because the tone is kind, refusing feels ungrateful. Someone on the team overshares about a personal problem in a meeting. It is framed as openness, and people respond with openness in return, and suddenly, the distance that used to exist between private life and work life is thinner. A person says no to a weekend project and notices that their manager is cooler to them for the next week. Nothing is said. Nothing needs to be said. The signal has been sent. Meanwhile, the worker who never says no, who answers messages at any hour, who never raises a concern, gets described as dependable, gets included, gets praised. The reward system is teaching a lesson, and the lesson is that availability is the condition of acceptance. Boundaries are not broken through conflict, they dissolve through warmth. Here is the part that takes people a long time to accept. The most loyal workers in a family-framed workplace are not the most protected. They are the most exploited. Not because the company is consciously targeting them, but because the structure makes it the efficient outcome. Loyal people absorb requests that other people refuse. Loyal people carry work that was never in their role. Loyal people stay late when staying late is optional, and they do not complain, and their silence gets read as capacity. Capacity gets more work assigned to it. A person who says no sometimes is treated as limited. A person who never says no is treated as infinite. The infinite person gets used until the well runs dry, and then the company is surprised, and the worker is told they need to manage their stress better. Loyalty, inside this frame, is not rewarded first. It is harvested first. The people who believe the most in the family language are the ones whose belief is most useful to extract from. Organizational behavior research has a term for voluntary extra effort at work: organizational citizenship behavior. The idea is that some workers go beyond their formal role because they care, because they are engaged, because they want the whole operation to succeed. In theory, this is voluntary. In a family-framed workplace, it stops being voluntary in any meaningful sense. The voluntary effort becomes the baseline. The baseline becomes the expectation. The expectation, unmet, becomes a character problem. A worker who does only their actual job, accurately and on time, is treated as underperforming because they are not visibly sacrificing. The above and beyond is no longer above, it is the new floor. And the framing of it as team spirit makes it almost impossible to push back against, because pushing back means admitting that you are not really part of the team. Forced extra effort gets handed back to the worker as a gift they chose to give. The work is not only the work. In a family-framed environment, a second layer of labor exists that nobody puts in the job description. You are expected to stay positive. You are expected to protect morale when morale is low. You are expected to perform gratitude for the privilege of being there. You are expected to suppress frustration in meetings, in the hallway, in casual conversation, because visible unhappiness threatens the culture they have built and need to maintain. This is emotional labor, and it is real labor. It takes energy. It depletes the same reserves the actual work depletes. Because it is invisible and unpaid, it does not count toward anything. You are not only doing the job, you are also maintaining the illusion that the job is something other than a job. That maintenance gets carried home every evening, built into the fatigue that has no clear source, because the source is a performance you have been running for 9 hours without naming it. Over months, the performance becomes habit. Over years, it becomes identity. The worker forgets which parts of their demeanor are theirs and which parts were installed by the job. In a well-functioning workplace, disagreement is information. A worker flags a problem, a leader hears the flag, the operation improves. That is how organizations learn. In a family-framed workplace, the same disagreement registers differently. It is not a data point, it is a rupture. The worker who raises concerns is no longer a contributor with useful observations. They are someone who failed a loyalty test. The vocabulary gives it away. People who push back get described as not a team player, as negative, as difficult, as bringing the wrong energy. These phrases are not neutral descriptions. They are social sanctions. They mark the person as someone whose future participation depends on changing their behavior. Because the words sound mild, the worker often cannot identify what happened to them. They only notice, over time, that they are being left out of conversations they used to be included in. Disagreement has been converted into a character flaw. The cost of repeating it is the ongoing erosion of standing. Most people, sensing the cost, stop disagreeing. The word family implies mutual obligation. In practice, the obligations are not distributed evenly. Workers are asked to sacrifice income for the team. Leaders are not asked to sacrifice margin. Workers are asked to absorb stress during difficult periods. Leaders are not asked to absorb equivalent stress in their compensation packages. Workers are asked to be flexible about hours, roles, expectations, and workload. The budget is never asked to be flexible about them. When a department underperforms, the pressure lands on individual contributors. When the department outperforms, the rewards tend to aggregate upward. None of this is necessarily personal. It is structural. The language of family hides the structure. It suggests that everyone is pulling together in a mutual arrangement, when the truth is that sacrifice flows one way and resources flow the other. The rhetoric of shared burden lives on the side that does the asking, not the side that does the absorbing. Under the warmth, the structure has not changed. There is still a hierarchy. One side has the authority to hire, to promote, to discipline, to fire, to restructure, to set pay, to determine workload, to decide what counts as acceptable performance. The other side does not. That imbalance is the defining fact of the relationship, and no amount of shared vocabulary alters it. A family, properly understood, is a unit of mutual obligation where no single member can unilaterally expel another. A workplace is an arrangement where one side can end the relationship at will, and the other side's survival depends on not being ended. Those two things are not the same. They cannot be made the same by language. What you are inside of is not family. It is dependence with better branding. The better the branding, the easier it becomes to forget that the dependence is what makes the whole thing run. Once the framing has been in place long enough, the worker begins to reproduce it. They start using the same language with new hires. They describe the team as family in conversations with friends outside work. They become unpaid transmitters of the frame, not because they were asked to, but because the language has become part of how they explain their own working life to themselves. This is how a rhetorical tool becomes a culture. It is not imposed from the top down. It circulates sideways through the mouths of people who have already accepted it, and each pass makes it slightly harder to see from the inside. When a worker accepts the family frame, they begin to expect reciprocity, not in theory, in the nervous system. They start to assume that the company will absorb hardship with them, will advocate for them in bad moments, will hold a place for them when life becomes complicated. This assumption is not stated, but it is present. When the assumption breaks, the break does not feel like an ordinary professional disappointment. It feels like a personal violation. The worker is not only losing a job or a role or a set of responsibilities, they are losing the frame they have been operating inside of. The story they told themselves about their own life collapses at the same time as their income. That is why the aftermath of these ruptures tends to look disproportionate to an outside observer. The outside observer is seeing a job loss. The person inside it is grieving a relationship that, it turns out, never existed in the form they believed. The family language is remarkably durable in good times. It appears in town halls, in onboarding, in the signatures of internal emails, on the merchandise handed out at offsites. It survives quarters of growth. It survives product launches. It survives leadership transitions. What it does not survive is a cost-cutting decision. When the financial math demands reductions, the language converts almost overnight into the vocabulary of contracts, headcount, restructuring, role elimination, talent rebalancing, performance-based separation. The people who are family on Monday receive calendar invitations on Tuesday for conversations that use none of the previous vocabulary. The warmth is gone. The language is procedural, legal, financial. The person delivering the news has usually been coached to stay on script and avoid emotional disclosure, which means the human being across the table has been converted into a role as well. The worker sitting opposite understands, often for the first time with total clarity, that the family framing was never an operating principle. It was a tool. It was useful during extraction and inconvenient during removal, so it was set aside when it became inconvenient. The severance document will not reference any of the previous vocabulary. The exit interview will be brief. The personal connections built over years will, in most cases, thin out within weeks because they were sustained by the environment and not independent of it. The language stayed emotional until the decisions became financial. And when the decisions became financial, the emotional language disappeared without explanation and without anyone on the company side feeling that an inconsistency had occurred. Certain kinds of workers absorb more of this than others. Conscientious people who take obligations seriously and feel bad when they cannot meet them. New hires who do not yet have the experience to recognize that the culture being sold to them is engineered. People who want to belong, which is most people at some point in their lives, particularly after an isolating period or a difficult transition. People who do not want to let others down, which sounds like a virtue and often is one, but which also functions as an exploitable trait inside a system built to trade belonging for sacrifice. These are not flawed workers. These are decent workers. The system feeds on their decency. It does not need to overwhelm a cynical or defensive worker. It only needs to reach the ones whose basic orientation is to show up, to help, to carry weight, to not be the problem. Those are the ones who pay the highest price for a culture branded as caring. None of this is an argument against warmth at work. Warmth at work is a good thing. Friendships at work are a good thing. Caring about the people you spend your days with is a good thing. The specific word family is doing rhetorical work that the word community or team or colleagues would not do. A community can be warm without implying unlimited obligation. A team can be supportive without suggesting that leaving it is a moral failure. Colleagues can care about each other without that care being used as leverage. The distinction worth drawing is between affection that comes with clarity about roles and affection that deliberately blurs those roles in order to extract more than clarity would allow. Healthy environments tend to have the first kind. Environments that repeat the family line during crunch weeks tend to have the second. There are specific patterns that recur across these environments, and once named, they are hard to unsee. The word family appears most often during crunch periods, not during slow ones. Saying no to an extra task gets described as an attitude problem rather than a scheduling choice. Asking about boundaries produces a conversation about how boundaries create distance. Overtime is praised more often and more publicly than efficiency. Conversations about pay are discouraged through a social pressure that frames them as unseemly. HR speaks warmly while enforcing something cold. Layoffs in the family language continue to coexist in the same week, with no acknowledgement from leadership that the two are inconsistent. People who leave are discussed in ways that imply moral failing. People who stay under strain are called committed. None of these patterns, taken alone, proves anything. Together, they form a signature. When more than 3 or 4 of them appear in the same workplace, the framework is almost certainly operating. The reason this arrangement keeps reappearing across industries, across countries, across decades, is that it benefits both sides psychologically in the short term. Workers want to believe they matter, that the place where they spend the majority of their waking hours is more than a paycheck, that they are seen. The family frame gives them that belief. Managers want to lead engaged teams without having to negotiate every marginal ask, and the family frame gives them that too. The costs show up later, and they tend to show up in ways that get attributed to individual problems rather than structural ones. An employee who burns out is called a worker with poor work-life balance, rather than the predictable output of a system designed to harvest availability. A leader who lays off the family is called a leader making a tough call, rather than a participant in a rhetoric that was always going to terminate. Sentiment hides exploitation more effectively than hostility ever could. Hostility provokes resistance. Sentiment produces gratitude. An honest workplace would use different words. It would say, "We are a team, and teams have roles, and the roles have clear compensation attached to them." It would say that effort beyond the agreed scope should be recognized in money or in time rather than in feelings. It would treat boundaries as structural requirements rather than obstacles to the culture. It would understand that disagreement is not disloyalty, that a worker raising a concern is doing the organization a favor. It would accept that people will leave and that leaving is not betrayal, that the relationship was always a professional one and ending it is not a moral event. This way of operating is sometimes mistaken for coldness. In practice, it runs on clarity. And clarity, in the long run, is more sustaining than warmth that turns out to be conditional. The moment a workplace asks for family-level sacrifice without family-level protection, it stops being culture and starts being extraction. Every worker sitting inside one of these environments has the right to see the exchange for what it actually is.